Film Oppenheimer has brought renewed attention to the history of the Manhattan Project, the research team that would bring the world's first nuclear weapon to life. But little is known about the consequences faced by many residents who lived and worked in the towns neighboring the Trinity testing site, where the bomb was first detonated. Morning Joe reporter Daniela Pierre-Bravo has been looking into that part of the story, and she joins us now. Daniela, what did you find out?
Good morning, guys.
I've always wondered about what happened with the repercussions of those that was affected whenever the test site went off. And now we're fixing to find out a little bit more about what began in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, towards the Manhattan Project, that Los Alamos, New Mexico basically finished it up by tweaking it and doing whatever needed to be done. And now you're fixing to hear where the people that had to sacrifice, I mean, if you wasn't sacrificing one way in East Tennessee towards having to give up property and work on a project that you really didn't even know what you was working on, then those that had to sacrifice during this event, not counting those that sacrificed toward ending World War II. It's just absolutely an entangling story of sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice just to be able to end World War II, to put civilization where civilization is today towards being a sensible, civilized civilization. And sometimes I tend to wonder if that's even questionable because of everything that's going on right now with China and Russia and etc. all over the world. Please listen.
Good morning, guys. Well, almost 500,000 New Mexicans were affected by the radiation fallout of the Trinity test. These residents who were not part of the Manhattan Project say they were never warned before the bomb went off and they were never evacuated. We traveled to the Trinity site and surrounding towns in New Mexico to find out why it's taken so long to hear about their stories, why they were never compensated, and what comes next. How long has your family had this ranch?
Since the late 1800s, huh?
The Pino family has called Carizoso, New Mexico, home for more than a century. Today they are known as downwinders, meaning they're one of many New Mexican families who lived downwind from the 1945 Trinity nuclear test site in New Mexico's Jornal del Muerto Desert. The blast location was famously depicted in the recently released Hollywood film Oppenheimer. This is the Trinity test site, where 78 years ago, the world's first nuclear weapon was successfully detonated. The Pino family ranch is just 35 miles east of Trinity.
They had cattle trucks on the outskirts of town that they were going to evacuate people with.
Ready, but they never did. While the infamous Trinity blast took place nearly 8 decades ago, the Pino family says it continues to feel its impact.
The first cousin?
Their mother and 3 of their older siblings were at this ranch when the test bomb detonated. Cancer diagnoses followed.
My mom died of cancer.
She went down fast.
So, Carmen, you had 3 brain tumors.
Mm-hmm. It was one, but it would break out and grow again. Mm-hmm. And so I was going blind.
Margie here has survived thyroid cancer. My brother Greg died of stomach cancer.
Before the blast, it's unclear what the Manhattan Project team knew about the health dangers of prolonged radiation exposure. But in a declassified memo on the after effects, the group's chief medical officer said less than a week after Trinity, the resulting dust cloud, quote, was potentially a very dangerous hazard over a band almost 30 miles wide, extending over 90 miles northeast of the site.
Now, I had known about that pertaining to the fallout. I didn't know exactly where the site was where they activated the atomic bomb, but I was aware that there was a cloud of fallout that went for miles. And according to their statistics here, you're looking at almost 100 miles long and 30 miles wide of anybody that was within that range. Basically got exposed to high levels of radiation.
The Pino's ranch was right in that zone. For decades, doctors have drawn connections between radiation exposure and health problems, up to and including cancer.
From the studies of the atomic bomb survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we know that there are multiple types of cancer for which risk is increased by radiation exposure. Other problems have shown up, like increased risk for heart disease and an actual reduction in how long people live. So we're still learning about the health effects of radiation, but clearly cancer is very well documented.
A new study.
And you know, one of the worst things about all of this is the fact that our ancestors, our American ancestors, was pushed to the brink of having to create such of a monstrous monster just to be able to prove to the tyranny type world at that time that the free world was not going to sit idly by and allow for that to occur pertaining to a madman called Adolf Hitler. The sad thing about it is that our people in America, regardless whether it was beginning in East Tennessee or it ended up in New Mexico, was pushed to the brink of being provoked, of having to create something like this just to be able to make a statement of ending World War II. And what's even sadder above and beyond even that sadness is that today, in the year 2023, people talk about nuclear holocaust or a nuclear bomb or a threat to society as if it was just something casual or moderate. And there is absolutely nothing casual or moderate about what you're seeing right there on TV. Because it's not just the initial blast, but it's what happens after that blast. It's actually on the same level as a volcano. Because if a volcano, let's say if Yellowstone National Park was to blow up the way that they claim that it may blow up one day, that not only will it affect the people's lives towards ending their lives that's within a certain radius of Yellowstone National Park, but it could actually blacken out the sun to the degree that it would cause agriculture not to grow properly, that could cause that much more damages pertaining to people's starvation. Whenever you get to looking at something on this magnitude, it reaches a magnitude of the forces of nature, but you know that it's not anything designed to be normal. But they had to create this abnormalness just to be able to end a cruel, indifferent war that was going on at the time, that if our ancestors did not create this, it is a very, very highly probability, not possibility, but probability, that we today in America would be speaking German and we would greet our judges, our authority figures, by raising up our hand and saying, "Hi, Hitler," in a tyranny type environment. The same type of environment that the Russians and the Russian government has placed upon to their citizens over in Russia. The same type of environment that the people over in China has to deal with pertaining to their leadership over there, that holds them under their lock and key. The same type of environment that is now going on in several other places all over the world. And if they're not being controlled in one form, they're being controlled in another form, but it's basically a form of tyranny, to the point that the people does not have the right to be able to vote in and out the politicians that they don't want in there. That's the sad part, is that our ancestors was forced into having to design something like this. But what's even sadder is that today they're even discussing more so of actually using this on the planet Earth, more so 75 plus years later than what they ever have. So you go from bad to badder to now worse. The worst case scenario would be if they actually done that. And if they did, it would be the end of civilization as we know it, not only on the planet, but also under the planet, in the water, above the air, all the above. That right there to me is just absolutely
Well documented.
It's wicked. It's absolutely wicked to see something that has that much magnitude about it, that if it was to ever be released on the planet, it would be one of the most horrifying experiences that humanity has ever began to think about witnessing or experiencing.
Released last month and currently being peer-reviewed, finds that the fallout of the Trinity blast was far bigger than originally thought, impacting as many as 46 states and Canada. In 1990...
And I've also heard that too as well. I didn't know how true that was, that it went beyond just New Mexico, that it actually went northeast, that affected thousands of lives that was in that range.
Legislation known as a Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, or RECA, was signed into law to provide monetary compensation to individuals residing downwind from atomic weapons tests. It included Nevada, Arizona, and Utah, but did not include New Mexico, despite the more than 450,000 residents that lived within a 150-mile radius of the Trinity test.
On this vote.
Now, a bipartisan amendment to RECA that would include New Mexican downwinders has passed the Senate and heads to the House later this year. Congresswoman Teresa Ledger Fernandez remains troubled that New Mexicans were left out of the original legislation.
It is environmental injustice at the most explosive proportions. There was no good reason for it.
Today, Fernandez is helping lead the bill through the House and helping downwinders' families connect the dots between generational medical issues and the original Trinity blast. Downwinder advocate Tina Cordova.
People didn't know about anything before it detonated. In this little village back then, there was no electricity. We lived very isolated. They didn't know what radiation exposure was. No one knew what cancer was. We hadn't heard those terms in our community before.
The work conducted at Trinity led to the eventual bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, which ended World War II in the Pacific. Now, downwinder advocates say it's time for the U.S. to compensate all downwinders for the role they played in ending the war to end all wars.
I would say that we didn't know how bad radiation was back then, but we know better now.
We reached out to the department.
We know better now, but yet now we're talking about it more so today towards actually using it on each other because of a madman over there called Putin, pertaining to a government that even Ronald Reagan exposed as being an evil empire because the way that it was treating its own citizens. It's unbelievable how mankind continues to want to take one step forward and then two steps back, one step forward and two steps back. And like I said, if we in our very worst imaginations cannot even begin to imagine how cruel and how cold and how callous and how tormentive that it would be if there was ever a true nuclear war. I don't care if you was to have a mind of the guy that designed all the Twilight Zone movies. You still would not be able to come close to the realization that if this ever took place, it would be the end. It would be the end to us all. It would be the end to us all.
The Department of Defense and the Department of Energy seeking comment about why these downwinders were never warned in advance about the Trinity blast, the lack of monitoring and inspection at the immediate aftermath of the blast, and why the downwinders have never been compensated. Both agencies declined to comment.
Wow.
No comment.
Yeah,
Daniela,
you
thank
know,
you very much for that report.
Isn't it fascinating that
Wow.
when they provided relief to everybody but New Mexico? Daniela, any reasoning why Congress left the original downwinders out of that bill?
Yeah, I mean, from everybody from activists to legislators, everybody says that's a $2.5 million question. A lot of people are seeking answers. As you saw, the reports about this and how it's been measured in the past are just coming to light now. So it seems like we'll finally get some restitution for these people who have been suffering for a while now.
A while? I can only imagine what it was like on the front end in comparison to now what it's like on the back end. And we want to, our government here in the United States wants to point our finger at how unfair that other government agencies are all over the world, in which they are, rightfully so. But you need to practice what you preach. You need to practice what you preach, especially at the expense of people's lives. It's the same scenario, though it's not quite as big as this scenario, but it's the same type of scenario as what went on with the ATF down in Mount Carmel in Waco that led to the explosion of what happened in downtown Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. I mean, there has to be accountability in seeing not just the negligence that various government officials participated in, but in what they actually participated in. Especially at the expense of people's innocent lives. In a roundabout way, if you go back to the Bible says to get the malt out of your own personal eye before you try to get the bean out of your brother or sister's eye. In other words, clean your own doorstep before you worry about trying to govern other people in cleaning theirs. And this government, the United States government, and don't get me wrong, I love this government. I love what our ancestors originally had the fortitude of designing and manufacturing and putting in place pertaining to our free, fair, open democracy. I love it to no end, pertaining to what we were supposed to have been. But at the same time, by me loving my government does not mean that I love various government officials that has caused our government to have become this way. It's awful. And how many sacrifices was made over a madman, Adolf Hitler, that costed the lives of so many innocent people. And this is just a drop in the bucket compared to the wholeness. If you get to looking at how many lives was lost during World War II, it was up in the millions. Something like 20 million people that died and all the suffering and all the fatalities that went along with the suffering. And to this day, 75 plus years later, people are still feeling the consequences of what went on, especially over in some of those war-ridden areas. And to think that we're thinking about using nuclear armament on one another, it goes beyond the capacity of comprehension. It goes beyond it. And I knew this whenever I went out west and I studied some of the things that I studied out in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and I got to understanding some of the in-depth seriousness of nuclear radiation activity. And that was one of the reasons why that I stood in line in Santa Fe, New Mexico, towards holding a sign and helping people protest against nuclear war, against nuclear armament. Well, you talk about a tight line to walk pertaining to using nuclear energy versus nuclear war. There's no question